what God is speaking and sharing what He is sharing. So we're going to start on the last beatitude today. The beatitude is the 8th, and it covers 3 verses. So starting in Matthew 5, verse 10, it reads, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." So this beatitude says a lot here. We're going to try to take it apart and put it back together again the way we have in all the other lessons. So we've already studied in verse 3 that the poor in spirit will receive the kingdom of heaven. Here again, Jesus repeats, saying that those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So this is an example of just one example of why you cannot separate verses and take them out of context. If you use the first verse and just say you only need to be poor in spirit to receive the kingdom of heaven, and don't use verse 10, then you leave out the fact that it's a requirement that you be persecuted for righteousness' sake. That's a weird thing to say. You need to be persecuted for righteousness' sake. So, I'm making the point here that if you are poor in spirit and understand the verses, if you try to make the verses stand alone, they're false doctrine. And when we don't review the entire word, then we miss out on what it actually says. So desire without works is empty. The consequences of not working are the same for those not letting God guide you through His Word. So I know, I feel it too. I can sit here and name all the rules I've followed to show that I am working for God, but working for God requires sacrifice to the point that people persecute. So, in question 1 here, how can we be sure we are working for righteousness' sake? What does verse 10 say? Or will be persecuted? That's right. That's the way we can be sure we're working for righteousness' sake. What's that look like? Well, it tells us a few things it looks like, but it doesn't tell us everything that it looks like, and that's what we're going to discover here. In fact, I'm not going to even try to tell you everything that persecution looks like. Persecution can take many forms, but I think the one thing we can say that all of them have in common is that it should be inconvenient, worldly inconvenience. You should have worldly inconvenience for your desire for righteousness. If you don't have worldly inconvenience for your desire for righteousness, then you're not suffering or persecuted, not suffering, but persecuted for righteousness' sake. So I think we'll see this as we go through the verses, and we'll start to determine what that suffering or what that persecution looks like. And we'll make the distinction between suffering and persecution. You can see I even want to say it, even though I know that that's not what it is. Persecution is not suffering. So persecution may not faze you at all. As a Christian, you may not even care that somebody's persecuting you. It doesn't mean you have to suffer. It means that you have to suffer worldly loss. If that worldly loss means nothing to you, then you suffer nothing. So you don't hurt because you lost something worldly to gain something spiritually. So I think we'll see that again as we walk through this, but we're going to see that persecution is not suffering, and that suffering does not necessarily mean that you're being persecuted. In fact, everybody suffers, and you suffer more if you are not a Christian. It's just what you suffer for that makes the difference. So let's take a look at a verse here. Let's take a look at Hebrews 10, a couple of verses. 32 through 34. Hebrews 10, verses 32 through 34. When somebody gets there, if they could read that.
Partly whilst ye were made a gazing stock, both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly whilst thou became companions of them that were so used. For ye take compassion on me, my bonds, and took joyfully hold of your goods, knowing yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and superior.
So here, for these Christians, we can see they both suffered and were persecuted. They suffered worldly loss, they suffered physical loss, and they suffered persecution. So we see here that persecution can include suffering, physical suffering. It can include mental suffering. It can include all kinds of suffering. But that persecution does not necessarily create a loss for you in a worldly sense. What persecution always does is it means that you have lost some worldly benefit. Some worldly benefit, maybe that you don't even care about, or maybe that you do care about. A lot of times I care about, not having a conversation with somebody who I know is not going to pay attention to what I'm saying. So I might just avoid letting them know who I am and what I believe. And so for that reason, I'm avoiding the precise thing that I'm being told I need to do. I don't want to talk to some person who says they're an atheist to start our conversation and say, well, so let me tell you about the Bible. I don't want to endure the persecution of just that person talking to me about what they believe and how sure they are of it. So I avoid even letting that person know who I am and what I stand for. And that's the exact opposite of what we are being told to do. So here, we've already kind of talked about it, but question 2 is, what affliction did Paul say these people endured? There's 2 or 3 things here that he says in these verses. Hebrews 10, 33 through 34, he talks about more precise. So here he says, they were a gazing stock both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly whilst you became companions of them that were so used. So they suffered because they were companions of those who professed their Christianity. They suffered being a spectacle for reproach and afflictions and they had suffered another, they suffered affliction by association with Paul because they were outcast from regular society. So what do we know about these Christians? Well, we know that there were few and that they were necessarily oppressed and outcast because regular society thought that they were wrong. Jews likely thought that other Jews that became Christians were lost because they were giving up the only true law, or the Mosaic law, and the Gentiles likely suffered ridicule from everyone because of how silly they thought that Christianity was. So the Christians in these verses were suffering not only physical ridicule, but they suffered the spoiling of their goods. What do you think? Question number 3 here. What do you think Paul means when he says you took joyfully the spoiling of your goods?
Jesus was better and more laid up for that flesh to be physical decision.
Exactly. That's exactly what he's saying here. That physical value of material things is, you didn't count that as your value. You didn't count that as the value of your life and what you direct your life toward. An example might be that you would gladly accept that some people would not hire you because of your service towards righteousness in this day. They may say, well, because you believe that, I don't want you on my work site. Or, I'm just giving an example. I don't know exactly all the things they suffered. It doesn't tell us here. But we know some of the things they suffered, and we know that the ability to give up worldly things is what is being talked about. When your spiritual value increases, your worldly physical value decreases. The Christians gladly traded their spiritual increase for a worldly decrease. That's really what's being said here. Trade your worldly increase for spiritual increase. So then serving righteousness increases our spiritual value and should then necessarily decrease value to the worldly. Not only when you increase your spiritual value, not only does your spiritual value increase, but your worldly value should be decreasing. If your worldly value, the things you hold dear of the world is not decreasing, then your spiritual value is not increasing. So those things, if you already do those things, if you already love people in general and want to spread the word, then you're in the right place. But if you have this tendency to want to avoid teaching others like I have in the past, then my spiritual value decreased and my worldly value increased. If we are not working to increase our spiritual value, then we're working to increase our worldly value, is another way of saying it. So here Paul is not saying you need to be beaten or imprisoned, although you should be willing to be beaten or imprisoned. But Paul is making the point that standing against whatever problems arise, that you should be willing to stand against whatever problems arise because people know you are a Christian and because of what you say and do. So what are some ways in number 4 here that people know you are a Christian? What you do. All right. What you don't do. All right.
What you say and don't say. Because
Exactly.
Paul, when he was, being accused because of his speech for Christ, it's like he was one of them because he didn't curse, I guess. And that's pretty much most of the world's standards. Don't want to get a job that doesn't allow that. And most people, jobs have to listen to that all the time.
Right? Yeah, this is, that's exactly what we do and don't do, what we say and don't say. Those are the things that show who we are. The point is to make yourself known as a single-minded Christian. Again, something I don't really want to do a lot of times. I don't want to be known. I don't want to have to defend. I don't want to have to talk about it, especially when I know the person's never going to get it, or I believe that they're never going to get it. I've built this up in my mind. Like, this person, I know them. I know what they do. I know who they are. They're never going to get it. Why should I even bring it up? And we lose value there, not only to ourselves, but to them.
The idea of not doing it because of how they're going to react, we use that as justification for not doing it. Because we don't really know how they're going to react.
Exactly. I just built this thing up in my mind and said, oh no, I don't want to deal with this conversation. Here goes an hour of my day wasted on this person who doesn't know anything about the Bible, and I'm going to have to start from scratch.
God said in the Old Testament, my word will not return to me void. So it may not be that we see the end result. It may be something that happens years down the road. So we're just trying to drip to the gospel, and that's our job, is just to put it out there and see what happens in the end.
Yeah. It may be that they don't get shaken away for years. Maybe that they never do. It doesn't matter. It's not your job to decide. Your job is to make it known that you're a Christian, and maybe if you're not making it known that you're a Christian, you're not working for righteousness' sake. I've been in situations where I want nothing more, like I said, than people not to know that I'm a Christian, not to know, not to have to describe what I think or what I believe and why I believe it. A lot of times it's because I didn't know how to do it. If you don't study enough, obviously you're not going to be able to make the case. So, we've got to be in the Word and studying. And if people don't know who you are and what you serve, then it's hard to serve righteousness. It's hard to serve God. God is righteousness, and if you're not serving righteousness, then you're serving unrighteousness. So let's take a look at another verse here and try to nail down exactly what we're talking about. If you turn to Romans 6:13 through 20, somebody read that when I get there.
Indeed, yield ye the members as instruments of unrighteousness as ye sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and the members as instruments of righteousness unto God. For sin shall not have dominion over you. Ye are not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? God forbid. Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. For God be thanked that ye were the servants of sin, but ye have obeyed from the heart the form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, ye become the servants of righteousness. I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of the flesh, for if ye have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity, unto iniquity, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. But when ye were the servants of sin, ye were free from righteousness.
So there's a lot said here about righteousness and unrighteousness. So let's try to unravel it a little. What two things does verse 13 here in Romans 6 say we can yield to? What two choices do we have?
Sin and righteousness.
Right? You can yield to unrighteousness, or you can yield to righteousness. If we yield to righteousness, the verse tells us that we are instruments of righteousness. And we become instruments of righteousness by yielding to God. So the righteousness you wield as a Christian is not your righteousness, but God's righteousness. So when we are serving God, we are putting out God's righteousness. So how do we learn to wield God's righteousness here in question 6? Not in the verse. Obedience. What to obey. Study the Bible. Exactly. If we don't study the Bible, we don't know what God's righteousness is. God's righteousness is twofold. It's one, His gift of mercy and grace to us, and God's righteousness for us to gain that mercy is to follow His precepts, and the only way we can do that is through the Bible. So in question number 7 here, what does verse 15 ask about sinning? Romans 6:15. Right. Yeah, it says, well, maybe we can just go ahead and sin, right? Then he ends the verse by saying, God forbid. This God forbid is not flippant like saying, I hope God forgives us for sinning. I've heard people say, God forbid, I hope that doesn't happen. That's not what God's saying here. Or that's not what the verse means. God forbid is a command, God forbid, not hope this doesn't happen, God forbid. God has forbidden that you should continue in sin. So God forbid is not a nice way of saying, hope you don't do it again. So what is meant by, in question 8 here, what is meant by, to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey? In verse 16.
Serve either evil or you want to serve good, righteousness and sin.
Exactly.
By the way that you live your life.
Right. You can serve Satan and therefore sin unto death. And this is not death, physical death. This is unto loss of your salvation. Or you can serve God unto life or salvation. So, Satan and sin are the same thing, just like God and righteousness are the same thing. So, who is to be thanked or praised for a Christian's obedience? It says it here in Romans 6:17. God is to be thanked. I think about this. I'd like to pat myself on the back. You did a good job. You didn't sin, But, I always, that's my first reaction when I think about sin. Oh, great job.
Passage of Scripture talks a lot in a very short way about grace. We hear it said that grace, we're all sinners. Thank God for grace. There's truth to that. But if you don't hear it talk very much like you do all of grace, the church has always stood up and taught the principle. It's not such thing as once saved, always saved. But the grace idea of being, the grace of God covers sin in the sense that if we're going to make a choice to sin, then grace will not cover it. And that's what this passage is talking about. we're going to choose to live unrighteousness, serve unrighteousness, then grace is of no value to us. And that's what the God forbid is, you got to give up the sin part, right, in order to receive grace part.
Yeah, like I said, God forbid is not a flippant thing saying, I hope not. God forbid is God forbid. He said, don't do it. He didn't say, I hope you don't do it. So,
the other part, God's done his part. It's up to us now. So I think, this talks a lot about it's a choice.
Exactly. It's all your choice. And your choice is shown by your works.
In your actions.
Exactly. If you don't do it, then you've chosen.
We live in a society where as long as you've got good intentions and you're okay, having good intentions is starting point as far as that goes. If you don't follow through, then nothing is benefited from you. Have a good heart about the whole situation, but if you don't follow through, then nothing.
Yeah. And having good intentions isn't even valuable if they're the wrong ones. You think they're good intentions. I listen to Joe Rogan sometimes, and I always think, you're right there. You're so close. Just you follow through. He hates the Bible. He always says he hates the Bible. He hates Christians because they're all so pious. But the point here is that he lives under a lot of the principles of the Bible. Where did he get them? We made them up because they're good for us. No, we didn't. How are they good for you? And who made them up? And how many of you get to decide? And when is it bad? How many of you have to decide it's bad before it's bad? So I think you get people think that they're close to serving goodness, and they're really so far away.
You go all the way back to the part about what it says in Matthew 5 is persecuted for righteousness' sake. That's the absolute standard. There's only one. That's what Rosen and anybody who can get into these talk show people that aren't Christians, they miss it big time because they don't understand that there is an absolute standard that we all have to answer to. It's not a matter of the majority coming to the conclusion that this is what's best for us, this is what's right and wrong. But they resist it. And we do too. If we're not careful, resist it. The fact that there's an absolute standard, and if I don't answer to it in the correct way, then I'm not doing it for righteousness' sake.
Back to the point we were making here about who's praised for your good works. I'm not praised. I'm not praising myself. I mean, we should be supportive of each other when we do good works, and we should be happy to do those good works. But the praise goes to God all the time, every time. There's no praise that comes to us. The blessing is already there for us in salvation. That's our praise. That's our glory based on what God gave us. But the praise goes all the way back to God. When I teach something, and hopefully I'm teaching it correctly up here. When I teach something correctly, the praise goes to God. When I do what I'm supposed to do, when I'm obedient and obey the precepts, then the praise goes to God, not to me. It's not the value added is for God. It's not for me. It helps me to get my salvation, but the real praise goes to God. So that's the point I think they're making here. And I think this is what I've started doing. I think if you thank God for you doing good works, then it changes everything about your input for God, your service to God. It gives you a better perspective of what a Christian is. If you change the way that you perceive your good works, service of God is for God, And I have to be careful to remember this daily. So in number 10 here, what have we already learned that we can relate to what it says here, but ye have obeyed from the heart? We've already learned something in one of the other Beatitudes about obeying from the heart. What about our single-mindedness of the pure in heart? We've already learned that the pure in heart are single-minded here. So this just reinforces what is said in the Beatitude about the pure in heart. So in number 11 here, when we obey the doctrine from the heart and we are made free from sin, what do we become? Here in verse 18, Romans 6:18. Exactly. We become servants of righteousness. If we are servants of righteousness unto salvation, then we are not righteous within ourselves, but servants of God, because God is righteousness. So we have to remember that when we serve righteousness, we're serving God, because God is righteousness. And finally, for these verses, what does verse 20 say about servants of sin in Romans 6:20?
Free from righteousness.
Exactly. You don't have any righteousness if you're serving sin. Not even a little of it. You are free from it. You have nothing to do with righteousness in this verse. So if you continue in sin, then God is nowhere to be found in your life. Even if you continue in small sins, or however you want to say it, if you continue in sin, you are free from righteousness. You have no righteousness. You take no part in salvation. It doesn't matter if you were baptized. It doesn't matter if you're singly just doing one thing, that you feel is righteousness. If I'm obeying, some of the precepts of God, none of that matters. You're free from righteousness if you continue to serve sin. So then what is Matthew 5:10 talking about when it says persecuted for God's sake? I think we need to consider what serving God looks like more than what persecution looks like. Because persecution here is something that happens because of what we do following the precepts of God. So serving God the right way will bring the right types of persecution. That sounds terrible. I'll get the right type of persecution, at least I'll be persecuted for the right thing, I guess. But because we are servants of righteousness, we should want that persecution. That persecution proves that you are serving God correctly. So what are you willing to give up to serve God? Are you willing to give up your job or your group of friends if necessary to prove that you serve God? I'm not saying you have to. You might not have to. But if it came to it, would you? I know I had a group of friends I had to give up. I didn't have a choice. They were not serving God. They were not anywhere close to what I needed. And I could have easily stayed with that group of friends over the group of friends I have today. It was so easy to be friends with those guys. They were fun. They did all kinds of crazy stuff. That gives me great stories to tell people. You think all these reasons why you should be serving sin. So God knows if you're serving Him. So it's not an easy thing to do. That's why he says you're going to be persecuted. If it was easy, then more people would do it. And there would be persecution. There would not be persecution for your actions, at least most of them, until somebody found something to persecute you over. So in speaking to persecution, I think the verses speak for themselves. So let's look at the actual verses of the Beatitude, Matthew 5, verses 12 and 13. Or, I think I put that wrong. 11 and 12, sorry. And it says, Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. So according to the verse in these two verses, what should we see as gain for God through us as Christians, through us being Christians here, through our service?
Conflict.
Yeah. Worldly persecution. Through our service to God, we should be ready to buffet the reviling and angry insults of others. We should be able to buffet the persecution of others. And when people make up lies about us, we should be able to buffet that with the fact that we know that we are saved. That what we are doing leads us to salvation. So in number 14 here, how does verse 12 end? I put the wrong verse. I think it's 11. How does verse 11 end? Sorry. It ends for my sake. So we're persecuted for God's sake. It starts with righteousness, and then it says for His sake. We cannot look at life through our own eyes and say that anytime we are persecuted, it's because we are Christians. We must recognize the difference between persecution for worldly laws and persecution for God's sake. I have heard people in the past say that they are suffering for God when people persecute them for their belief in God. But if you look closer, there may be other factors involved. I may just be an annoying person. Even in the delivery of the message of God, it could be that I'm delivering it in a way that repulses people. And maybe the worst is that I'm not reflecting God's light in my life, but then I'm trying to teach others His Word. They can see my actions do not match what I'm professing to believe. For us as Christians, this may be the most deadly of all to others. If I walk in sin and give the appearance that I am sinning by not showing God's light, then my words cannot overcome people's opinion of me. And if everyone looks at me and can say that I look like a sinner, then I may be a sinner and not a persecuted Christian. So thoughts of piety may be outweighing Christian or actions of devotion. So remember that just your thought of who you are is not always what your actions are. In this case, your persecution is warranted and there is no salvation for you. God wants to support you and ease your suffering when you are executing His commandments. If you are living something other than God's precepts, He will not only allow you suffering to weigh you down, but your suffering will multiply. This is just what happens when you live without single-mindedness of heart. Your suffering should be working toward making you change toward a better relationship with God. And then we'll continue on next week with this to wrap it up. But I think the last point we really have to make here is what are we rejoicing and glad about? And then we'll also talk a little bit about the difference between persecution and suffering and what that means for us. Thank you.